Okay, so, you sent this piece in, and it's called The Good Wine, Why It Matters That Jesus Wasn't God. And wow, it's a pretty bold statement right off the bat.
Yeah, it
It
is.
makes you kind of stop and think, right? Like, wow, okay, this is something different. What was it for you that, when you first read it, that kind of like what stood out to you?
I think what's really interesting is that it's a personal journey for the author.
Yeah.
They're not just like rejecting an idea they were taught. They're actually describing a personal transition from, just accepting something to really understanding it on like a deeper, maybe even more meaningful level. And the implications of that are huge. I mean, we're talking about the very nature of Jesus,
Right.
right? Like, was he divine or was he fully human?
Yeah, and the piece really dives right into that central question.
Yeah.
Like, how does our understanding of faith and, everything really change if we view Jesus not as God, but as like completely human? The author really makes you think that this could be a more hopeful and, easier to grasp approach to faith. You mentioned that this whole idea really resonated with you and your desire to understand things thoroughly. So let's really break this down.
Yeah, definitely. So the author starts off by talking about how they just accepted that Jesus was God for a long time. It's what they were taught,
Yeah.
like almost by default. And that sets the stage for their search for a faith that really connected with them on a personal level.
Right, and that leads us to like the main conflict the piece explores, this whole idea of Jesus being divine, part of the Trinity, versus him being a human being, someone who walked the same path that we walk. So let's dive in and see how the piece lays out the traditional view first, and then how the author challenges it.
Okay, so the piece acknowledges that a lot of people believe that Jesus is God. Of course, right, that's pretty standard. But then it throws in this question that makes you pause and rethink everything.
Yeah.
It asks if Jesus was God. Were his actions really acts of faith, the way we understand them? Like his obedience, resisting temptation, and, going to the cross? Or were they something else entirely?
Yeah, and the author puts it so bluntly. If Jesus is God, he didn't need faith. He had knowledge. And knowledge doesn't require trust.
That's such a powerful statement, right? It implies that if Jesus already knew the outcome, the whole concept of faith, stepping into the unknown, trusting despite uncertainty wouldn't even apply to him.
Exactly. And this is where the author presents what they see as a much more powerful and hopeful alternative. The idea that Jesus was fully human, they highlight his human experiences, like weeping, praying in anguish, and facing the very real choice of going to the cross. For you, what's the biggest difference when you compare these two perspectives? I think for me, it's that the author makes Jesus's example seem attainable. They ask, what if the most incredible thing about Jesus wasn't that he was God pretending to be human, but that he was just human and still lived like that?
Yeah.
It changes everything. It's like suddenly his achievements aren't these divine feats anymore. They become the result of incredible human commitment and faith.
Right. And if Jesus went through real human struggles and doubts, then his obedience to God wasn't just him following some divine script. It was an active, courageous choice rooted in faith.
Yeah.
The author argues that this makes faith like super important.
And that connects directly to like our own faith, right? The piece makes the point that if Jesus as a human being relied on faith, then our faith as humans is hugely important. The author says, if Jesus was a man, then faith matters. And if faith matters, yours does too. And that changes everything. It's a powerful validation of our personal spiritual journey.
To emphasize how crucial faith is, the author brings up Hebrews 11:6. Without faith, it is impossible to please God. The idea here is that Jesus pleased God through his life of faith. It shifts the focus away from his divine nature being like the sole basis of his relationship with God. Yeah, the article goes into some territory that might be a little sensitive for some people. The doctrine of the Trinity. The author suggests that while the Trinity might have been intended to explain Jesus' nature, it actually ends up creating a barrier between us and him and makes it harder to truly connect with him and follow his example. What do you think about that? Yeah, the author uses pretty strong language. They say the Trinity hijacks Jesus' humanity. The idea is that by putting so much emphasis on his divinity, we end up with this untouchable figure of worship, someone who's fundamentally different from us rather than a relatable example of how to live.
And they share this really powerful moment with their husband who asked, if Jesus is God, why would I try to be like him? He's not like me. He always knew how it would end.
Right. I mean, that really cuts to the core of the problem, doesn't it? It highlights this disconnect that can exist between worshiping someone divine and trying to live like a human being. What struck you about that?
I think it's a brilliant observation. It gets to the heart of why some people struggle to connect Jesus' life with their own. If it's not a level playing field, if Jesus had divine certainty, How can we learn from his struggles and his choices?
Right. And then the piece talks about how the husband had this profound moment of connection with Jesus' humanity when he cried out on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" In that moment of seeming abandonment and, total anguish, he saw not a divine being just playing a role, but a man facing real fear and uncertainty, a man who had to choose to trust even when it seemed like God was silent. And the author summarizes this shift in thinking with a really powerful line. It turned a man we could follow into a God we can't touch. It perfectly captures the argument against focusing on Jesus' divinity over his humanity, especially when you consider how it impacts our ability to relate to and learn from his life.
The article then goes on to examine specific moments in Jesus' life from this perspective of his full humanity, like his baptism, for example. The author proposes that Jesus received the Holy Spirit not because he was God, but because he needed it, just like all of us need it. It's seen as this moment of empowerment for him as he begins his human journey. What do you think is important about that interpretation?
It reframes the baptism. It's not about confirming some pre-existing divinity. It becomes the starting point of Jesus' human ministry, empowered by the Spirit. It suggests that the Spirit is a source of strength for all believers, not just this inherent divine power that Jesus possessed.
And the temptation in the wilderness is also seen differently. The author emphasizes that Jesus wasn't being tempted as this all-powerful being, but as a human being who was hungry alone and wrestling with really difficult questions. His resistance wasn't effortless divine power. It was a conscious choice that he made by relying on his knowledge of the scriptures and his trust in God, which is a powerful example for us when we face temptation.
Yeah, and the author points to Jesus' own words, like when he said, "I do nothing on my own, only what the Father shows me." This isn't about one part of the Trinity submitting to another. It's about a human being completely dependent on God and working in partnership with him. It shows how much Jesus relied on the divine instead of acting solely through his own supposed divine power.
And this perspective leads to some different interpretations of what the cross really means. The author presents some really interesting ideas, like the cross could represent humanity rejecting light, or Jesus taking on the weight of our anger and brokenness instead of it being about God needing to be appeased or punished. What stands out to you the most in these different interpretations?
The idea that the crucifixion was this clash between love and truth on one side and power and fear on the other, that's really powerful. It moves away from seeing the cross as just this transaction between God and humanity and focuses on the radical nature of love and the opposition it faces.
Yeah. And when you think about it, like that Jesus's words from the cross, Father, forgive them, become even more profound. It's not just a divine being saying something out of obligation. It's a human being filled with the Holy Spirit showing us what true forgiveness really looks like.
And this understanding really supports the author's point that the early Jesus movement wasn't primarily about establishing a new religion all about worship. It was a call to change, a call to follow a specific way of being in the world.
Right. The author uses Romans 12.2, be transformed by the renewing of your mind, and Ephesians 4.24, put on the new self, created to be like God in true righteousness, to back up this idea that inner transformation was the core of the original message. So it's not about some future reward, it's about a present reality that we can experience through ongoing personal change.
And the concept of atonement is also seen in this light. Instead of Jesus being this shield between us and God's anger, the author suggests that atonement is about God entering into our brokenness, absorbing the consequences of our actions, and inviting us to do the same, to break the cycle of pain and destruction. And this is possible, the author argues, because Jesus shows us what it means to be fully human and fully connected to God's Spirit.
The author uses this beautiful image of Jesus as the firstborn of many brothers and sisters. He's like a prototype, not this isolated divine figurehead. This connects back to the idea in Romans 8.14, all who are led by the Spirit of God are sons of God, and the powerful concept of Christ in you, the hope of glory, from Colossians 1.27. It shifts the focus away from this impossible gap between the divine and the human, and shows us that transformation is something we can all experience.
And this leads to a direct challenge to you, the listener, and to all of us. The author is calling us to choose trust over certainty, to walk the same path that Jesus walked, even though it means being vulnerable and embracing the unknown. What does that challenge mean to you? To choose trust over certainty?
It makes me think about what faith really is. It's not about having all the answers. It's about taking that step forward even when we don't know what's ahead. The piece ends with this really powerful analogy of the good wine. Can you tell us more about that metaphor?
Of course. The author contrasts the good wine with what they call the watered-down version of the gospel that's common today, which they compare to grape juice. It might be sweet and safe, but it lacks the transformative power of the real thing. The good wine, on the other hand, represents the authentic message, the one that's strong and clear and changes people deeply.
So the grape juice message is about a more passive kind of belief, maybe focusing on accepting certain doctrines without necessarily leading to real personal change. While the good wine that Jesus offers calls for a much more active engagement. It pushes us to become like him in our actions and in our spirit.
Right. The author suggests that maybe the historical focus on Jesus' divinity has unintentionally led to this watered-down version. But now this good wine, this understanding of Jesus as fully human, empowered by the Spirit, is being offered again.
And that's huge, right? I mean, if Jesus as a human being lived a life of faith and obedience to God, then we as humans can do the same thing. This makes the idea of the kingdom not just some far-off theological concept, but something that can actually happen in our lives.
And the author ends with this powerful invitation, not just to believe, to become. They describe the good wine as fermented in faith, poured in love, a covenant not written in doctrine but in blood, obedience, and trust. And they ask a direct question, will you drink?
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the good wine, the main idea is this radical shift in perspective. Understanding Jesus primarily as a human being rather than solely as God might be the key to a much deeper and more authentic faith.
It speaks directly to your desire for a faith that's relatable and that you can put into practice. The author presents a really compelling alternative by focusing on the transformative example of a fully human Jesus empowered by the Spirit. Instead of seeing divinity as something distant and unattainable,
And it leaves us with this really important question. How does seeing Jesus as fully human resonate with your own understanding of faith and your ability to follow his example? What could this mean for your spiritual journey and how you view your place in the world? It's definitely a lot to think about.
absolutely. We encourage you to go back and read the source material again, maybe explore other viewpoints on this really fascinating and complex topic, and keep wrestling with these questions in your own life.
Thank you so much for sharing this thought-provoking piece with us and for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time.